quiet heart in Harmony Creek. The late morning sun, filtered through the delicate lace curtain, painted a warm rectangle on the polished pine floor. Sarah sat by the window, a half-finished quilt draped over her lap, her needle poised. Outside, Daniel and Mary chased a flock of indignant chickens across the yard, their laughter bright and clear, a stark contrast to the quiet ache that resided deep within Sarah's chest. A year. A full year since the world had tilted on its axis, since Jacob's strong hands had grown still, his gentle voice silenced. The anniversary had passed like a whisper, leaving behind a heavier stone of grief than she'd anticipated. Her gaze, however, was fixed on her children. Daniel, nearly 7, was all gangly limbs and earnest concentration, his straw hat askew as he tried to herd a particularly stubborn hen. Mary, a lively 4-year-old, skipped alongside him, her little pink bonnet bouncing with each movement. They were Jacob's legacy, living, breathing reminders of the love they'd shared. And for them, Sarah found the strength to rise each morning, to tend the garden, to bake the bread, to stitch the seams. The rhythms of Harmony Creek were a comfort, a predictable pulse in a world that had felt so chaotic. The clatter of the milk pail at dawn, the distant murmur of a neighbor's buggy, the drone of bees in the clover. These routines were her anchors. This morning, she'd already kneaded the dough for rye bread, the smell of yeast still lingering faintly in the kitchen. The carrots in the garden needed weeding, and a stack of mending awaited her patient needle. Each task was a small act of defiance against the despair that sometimes threatened to overwhelm her. She remembered Jacob once, leaning against the sturdy oak tree, watching her weed the same patch of carrots. He'd wiped a bead of sweat from her brow with the back of his hand, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "You work too hard, Saraline," he'd murmured, his voice a low rumble. She'd laughed then, a light, carefree sound she rarely heard from herself these days. "Someone has to keep this patch from being swallowed by weeds, Jacob." He'd just smiled, a quiet, knowing smile that had always reassured her. The memory, brief and sharp, brought a familiar sting to her eyes. She blinked, forcing it back, focusing instead on the vibrant yellow of Mary's dress as she twirled. A chicken, having escaped Daniel's gentle persuasion, darted under Sarah's window, squawking indignantly. Daniel, with a sigh of mock frustration, pursued it. "Mary, help me!" he called, his voice a charming blend of command and plea. Mary, ever eager to assist, giggled and joined the chase, her small legs pumping. Sarah watched them, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching her lips. They were so full of life, so untainted by the shadow that clung to her. She thought of the quilt in her lap, a kaleidoscope of blues and greens and soft creams. Jacob had loved her quilts, the way she could transform scraps into something beautiful and warm. He'd often snuggled under them on chilly evenings, reading his Bible aloud, his voice a soothing balm. Her fingers, calloused from years of work, picked up the needle. A small, dark blue triangle was next. Each stitch was a tiny act of creation, a thread connecting her to the past and, perhaps, to a future she couldn't yet imagine. The quiet hum of the house, the distant chirping of crickets, the rhythmic swing of the children's laughter, it all wove into a tapestry of life, a life that continued, even with a quiet heart. She wasn't ready to let go of Jacob, not truly, but for Daniel and Mary, she would keep moving forward, one careful, stitched-together day at a time. The stone in her chest remained, but perhaps, with each sunrise, its edges might soften, just a little. For now, the gentle rhythm of Harmony Creek was enough. A faint clatter from the kitchen pulled her from her reverie, Mary, no doubt, attempting to reach the cookie jar. Sarah sighed, a fond, weary sound. The quiet was about to be broken, but it would be a welcome disruption. She placed the quilt carefully aside, her gaze lingering on the vibrant squares. Tomorrow, she would finish it. Tomorrow. The storm and the stranger. The sky, a bruised purple at midday, had been a clear warning. Sarah hurried her children inside, the air growing heavy and still, holding its breath before the onslaught. Then came the wind, a primal shriek that tore through Harmony Creek, rattling the small farmhouse windows with violent intent. Rain followed, not in drops but in sheets, flung horizontally against the glass, blurring the world outside into a watery abstract. Daniel, usually so boisterous, clung to Sarah's skirt, his small face pale, while Mary, eyes wide, pointed a trembling finger at the furious downpour. Sarah held them close, murmuring comforting words, but her gaze kept drifting to the sturdy oak tree near the shed. She'd watched it sway, then bend, then crack with a sound like thunder itself, a sound distinct from the storm's roar. The shed, a sanctuary for Jacob's tools and her quilting frames, shuddered under the impact. A sickening crunch followed, and then the groaning timber of the roof gave way. A cold dread settled in her stomach, another piece of their life, broken. By morning, the storm had passed, leaving behind a landscape utterly transformed. Trees lay uprooted, their massive root balls exposed like raw wounds. Fences were splintered, and several outbuildings, including Sarah's shed, stood half-collapsed, their skeletal frames stark against the muted dawn sky. The usually pristine lanes were littered with branches and debris, turning familiar paths into obstacle courses. Community members, emerging from their homes, surveyed the damage with grim faces but resolute spirits. Bishop Stoltz, his shoulders stooped but his gaze sharp, walked among them, offering quiet words of comfort and assessing the widespread destruction. Men gathered, their voices low, already discussing the colossal task ahead. Women set up tables in the meeting house, preparing warm drinks and food for the workers. Sarah, holding Mary's hand, watched Daniel try to navigate a path around a felled maple tree, his usual chicken-chasing energy temporarily subdued by the scale of the devastation. Her shed, now just a mangled ruin of wood and tin, was a stark reminder of the long road to recovery. She felt a familiar ache, a dull throb of helplessness. Later that afternoon, the community gathered at the meeting house, their faces etched with fatigue and worry. Bishop Stoltz stood before them, his voice calm, cutting through the murmurs of concern. "The storm has been a harsh test," he began, his gaze sweeping over the assembled faces, "and many of us have lost much. Our barns, our sheds, our fences. The work ahead is considerable." A collective sigh rippled through the room. They were a community of strong backs and willing hands, but even they had their limits. The sheer scale of the damage felt overwhelming. "I have spoken with the elders," Bishop Stoltz continued, his voice gaining a firmer note, "and we have made a decision. This is beyond what we can manage alone, not with winter approaching. We will accept outside help." A ripple of surprise, then murmurs, spread through the room. Outsiders, Englishers, were rarely invited into their close-knit world for such extended periods. Sarah felt a prickle of unease, mixed with a strange flicker of curiosity. "A carpenter will be arriving," the bishop announced, his gaze settling for a moment on Sarah. "An Englishman, highly recommended. He will stay with the Miller family for the duration of the repairs. His name is Jacob." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. The name, spoken so casually, struck her like a physical blow. She clutched Mary's hand tighter, her breath catching in her throat. Jacob. The irony was a cruel twist. She glanced around the room, wondering if anyone else had noticed, if anyone else understood the sudden, sharp pain that had just pierced her carefully constructed piece. But the faces around her held only expressions of relief, or perhaps lingering apprehension about the unknown English stranger. She was alone in this. The storm had passed, but another, more personal tempest was brewing on the horizon. Thomas's arrival. The rumble of a distant engine announced Thomas's arrival long before his truck materialized through the lingering morning mist. Sarah, hands clasped tightly at her waist, watched from her porch as the foreign vehicle, a battered but sturdy pickup, navigated the muddy track leading into Harmony Creek. It was a jarring sight, the shiny metal and dark tires a stark contrast to the muted, natural tones of their village. Bishop Stoltz, already standing by the meeting house, offered a curt nod as the truck slowed to a halt. A man unfolded himself from the driver's seat. He was taller than Sarah had expected, with a lean build and hair the color of rich earth. But it was his eyes that truly captured her attention. A startling shade of blue, framed by faint lines that spoke of laughter and perhaps a touch of weariness. He offered Bishop Stoltz a quiet greeting, his voice a low, even tone, and a warm, disarming smile briefly touched his lips. He didn't seem to notice Sarah, or if he did, he made no overt sign of acknowledgement. He was simply present. Bishop Stoltz gestured towards the collapsed shed behind Sarah's house, then indicated the various damaged structures across the community. Thomas listened intently, occasionally interjecting with a soft query about materials or specific structural concerns. He moved with an economical grace, retrieving a worn toolbox from the truck bed. There was no fuss, no grand pronouncements, just a quiet readiness to begin. He started not with the most visible damage, but with the smaller, more accessible repairs. Sarah watched as he began to shore up a leaning fence post near the community garden, his movements precise and unhurried. He worked with a quiet intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration, yet his expression remained calm, almost serene. He seemed to blend into the background, his presence a soft hum rather than a jarring chord. Later that afternoon, as the sun began its slow descent, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Thomas moved towards her property. Sarah felt a familiar knot tighten in her stomach. He walked past the remains of her shed, his gaze lingering for a moment on the splintered wood and scattered tools. He didn't touch anything, didn't invade the space. Instead, he turned his attention to the porch railing, which had been ripped from its moorings. Daniel and Mary, their initial apprehension giving way to childlike curiosity, crept closer, their small figures peeking from behind the elm tree. Thomas, engrossed in his work, didn't seem to notice them at first. But then he paused, retrieving a small, smooth stone from his pocket and placing it carefully on the damaged railing. He glanced up, his blue eyes meeting Mary's wide, curious gaze. A gentle smile, devoid of any pretense, spread across his face. "Hello there," he murmured, his voice soft, almost a whisper. "Looks like a bit of a mess, doesn't it?" Mary giggled, a shy, musical sound. Daniel, emboldened by his sister's reaction, stepped forward. "Are you fixing it?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Thomas nodded, resuming his methodical work with a hammer and nails. "That's the plan," he replied without looking up. "It'll be stronger than before, I promise." He worked steadily, the rhythmic tap-tap of his hammer a comforting sound in the fading light. He didn't try to engage them in lengthy conversation, didn't demand their attention. He simply worked, his quiet dedication a silent invitation. Sarah watched from her doorway, a complex tapestry of emotions weaving through her. The name Jacob still echoed in her mind, a ghost of a memory that pricked at her heart. But this man, Thomas, was different. He carried a quiet strength, an unassuming kindness that was both comforting and unsettling. His presence was a ripple in the still pond of her grief, and she couldn't tell if it would bring clarity or further disturbance. She only knew that Harmony Creek, and perhaps her own heart, would never quite be the same. Little boats and laughter. The rhythmic thwack of Thomas's hammer against wood carried on the breeze, a new sound in Harmony Creek, steadily replacing the mournful creaks of damaged structures. Sarah watched him from the kitchen window, her hands automatically kneading dough for supper. He'd moved on to the shed behind their house that morning, the one Jacob had built with such meticulous care, each plank a testament to his quiet strength. Thomas worked with an economy of motion, his broad shoulders flexing under his plain shirt. He wasn't loud, didn't call attention to himself, yet his presence was undeniable, a solid anchor against the shifting tide of her grief. Daniel and Mary, usually playing in the muted quiet that had become their norm, gravitated towards the shed like moths to a flame. Sarah saw Daniel first, peeking around the corner of the house, his small hand gripping Mary's sleeve. Their initial apprehension, A shadow that had clung to them since their father's passing seemed to thin in the face of Thomas's focused industry. He knelt to examine a splintered board, his tools laid out neatly on a canvas tarp beside him. Then Thomas looked up. He didn't startle, didn't jump, just paused, his blue eyes catching sight of the children. A gentle smile touched his lips, the same gentle smile that had offered a quiet promise to make things stronger than before. He picked up a piece of discarded wood, a smooth, pale offcut, and ran his thumb over its grain. He didn't speak, just held it out. Daniel, emboldened by the silent invitation, took a hesitant step forward, then another. Mary, ever his shadow, followed, clutching a worn rag doll. Thomas, without a word, produced a small, sharp knife from his belt and began to whittle. Sawdust, pale as flour, drifted from the wood as he carved, his movements precise and unhurried. The children watched, their faces a canvas of pure, unadulterated curiosity. Within minutes, a rudimentary boat took shape under his deft fingers. He smoothed its edges, carved a tiny mast, and then presented it to Daniel. "For the creek," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. Daniel's eyes, usually downcast, widened with an almost forgotten spark. He took the boat, turning it over in his hands, a nascent smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Mary, not to be outdone, let out a small, insistent whine. Thomas chuckled, a warm, unexpected sound that made Sarah pause in her kneading. He found another piece of wood, slightly smaller, and began to carve again. This time, he added a tiny sail fashioned from a scrap of canvas. When he handed it to Mary, she giggled, a sound like wind chimes after a long silence. It was a sound Sarah hadn't heard in what felt like an eternity, a melody she had feared was lost forever. The children scurried off, their boats clutched tightly, heading towards the narrow stream that ran along the edge of their property. Their hushed voices, usually just above a whisper, rose in excited chatter. Sarah watched from the window, her hands still in the dough, but her focus now entirely on the scene unfolding outside. She saw Daniel launch his boat, his face alight as it bobbed downstream. Mary, after a moment of careful consideration, followed suit, her own boat dancing on the water. Then, a laugh. A full, joyous, uninhibited laugh from Daniel, echoing across the yard. And then Mary, her high-pitched giggle joining his, a duet of pure, unburdened delight. Sarah felt a strange catch in her chest, a bittersweet pang. Jacob had made them toys, of course, simple wooden animals, but he hadn't made them laugh like this recently, not with the lightness of true childhood joy. His grief had been a heavy blanket over them all. Thomas, meanwhile, had returned to his work, the steady rhythm of his hammer resuming. He didn't look towards the children, didn't seem to seek their attention, yet his simple act had unleashed a torrent of happiness that resonated through the quiet afternoon. Sarah watched her children chase their little boats, their laughter a balm on her raw spirit. A strange mix of apprehension and something akin to gratitude stirred within her. This man, this quiet stranger, was bringing back a light she hadn't realized had dimmed so completely. And for the first time in a long time, the silence in their home didn't feel quite so empty. Quiet offerings. The rhythmic thwack of Thomas's hammer became as much a part of the creek's soundscape as the chirping of crickets or the murmur of the water itself. Weeks drifted by like dandelion seeds on the wind, each day carrying with it a subtle shift in the household's atmosphere. The shed, once a leaning skeleton of splintered wood, began to regain its square shoulders, its new timbers glowing golden in the afternoon sun. Daniel and Mary, initially hesitant to approach the tall, silent man, were now drawn to him like moths to a lamp. Thomas, in turn, seemed to possess an endless reservoir of patience and quiet amusement. While his hands worked, shaping wood with practiced ease, his voice would weave tales of places far beyond Harmony Creek. He spoke of cities where buildings touched the clouds, of oceans vast and blue, where fish swam in shimmering schools, and of mountains so grand Their peaks wore caps of eternal snow. Mary, perched on an overturned bucket, listened with wide, unblinking eyes, a half-eaten apple forgotten in her small hand. Daniel, usually restless, sat cross-legged on the grass, tracing patterns in the dirt with the stern of his wooden boat, utterly captivated. Laughter, light and unburdened, began to ripple from their corner of the yard, a sound Sarah hadn't realized how desperately she missed until it returned. It was a fragile, precious sound, like glass chimes in a gentle breeze, and it brought a warmth to her chest she hadn't felt in a long, long time. Sarah, observing from the kitchen window, felt a stirring of something akin to gratitude. The children's faces, once shadowed with an adult's sorrow, were now bright with a child's wonder. The whittled boats, simple yet imbued with an almost magical quality, had become their most cherished possessions. Daniel would launch his in the creek, imagining it sailing to the distant lands Thomas described, while Mary would cradle hers, whispering secrets to its smooth wooden hull. One particularly warm afternoon, as the sun beat down, turning the air hazy, Sarah found herself pouring a glass of cool well water. She hesitated for a moment, then, on an impulse, sliced a generous piece of the apple pie she'd baked that morning. Carrying the tray, she walked across the yard, the grass cool beneath her worn shoes. Thomas straightened from where he was planing a beam, his movements fluid and unhurried. The scent of fresh-cut pine filled the air around him. He met her gaze, a faint, almost imperceptible nod acknowledging her presence. "It's a warm day," Sarah offered, her voice a little softer than usual. She extended the tray. "For your thirst." He took the glass, his fingers brushing hers for a fleeting moment, a warmth that surprised her. "Thank you, ma'am. That's very kind." His voice was low, a rumble like distant thunder, yet gentle. He then took the plate with the pie. "And the pie, too. It smells wonderful." Their conversations were never long, often punctuated by comfortable silence. They spoke of the weather, of the progress of the repairs, of the changing colors of the leaves on the maples bordering the property. He rarely offered details about himself, and Sarah, respecting his quiet nature, didn't pry. Yet, with each passing day, with each shared glass of water or slice of pie, a subtle current of understanding seemed to flow between them. Sarah noticed the meticulous care he took with every joint, every nail. He worked with a quiet reverence for the wood, as if each piece held a story. And as she watched him, day after day, she found herself anticipating his presence. The sight of his truck pulling up the lane in the morning, the sound of his hammer echoing through the yard, had begun to weave themselves into the fabric of her days. It wasn't just the repairs to the barn and the shed that were taking shape. Something within her, too, was slowly being rebuilt, shingle by quiet shingle. The sharp edges of her grief, though still present, felt less raw, softened by the unexpected solace of shared silence and the newfound laughter of her children. One evening, after Thomas had packed up his tools and driven away, leaving behind the comforting scent of sawdust, Sarah watched Daniel and Mary enact a grand voyage with their boats in a puddle left by the afternoon shower. Daniel, eyes alight, declared his boat was sailing to the cloud-touching city. Mary, cradling hers, whispered that it was heading to the great blue ocean. Sarah smiled, a genuine, unforced curve of her lips. The quiet offerings, she realized, were not just for Thomas, but for her and her children, too. They were gifts of hope, wrapped in the simple kindness of a stranger. A gentle touch. The late afternoon sun, a buttery wash of light, slanted through the half-finished shed, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Thomas, his hammer a rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping crickets, worked with a focused intensity that belied his gentle demeanor. Mary, her bright yellow dress a splash of color against the faded green of the grass, chased a butterfly with Daniel's whittled boat clutched in her hand, her laughter a light, tinkling sound Sarah hadn't heard in what felt like a lifetime. Sarah watched from the porch swing, a basket of mending forgotten in her lap. The sight of her children's unburdened joy was a balm, a quiet symphony playing against the persistent ache in her chest. Suddenly, a sharp cry pierced the peaceful air. Sarah's heart leaped. Mary, her small form a crumpled heap by the old oak, wailed, her boat lying discarded beside her. Sarah was off the porch in an instant, her mind racing through worst-case scenarios. Thomas was already there, kneeling beside Mary. His large, calloused hands, so adept with wood and nails, were surprisingly delicate as he gently assessed the damage. Mary's knee was scraped, a raw, angry red against her pale skin, and a thin trickle of blood began to well. "It's all right, little one," Thomas murmured, his voice a low, comforting rumble. He looked up at Sarah, his eyes the color of a summer sky meeting hers. "Just a scrape. Do you have a cloth and some water?" Sarah nodded, her voice caught somewhere in her throat. She hurried inside, her hands fumbling in the medicine cabinet for the antiseptic and bandages. When she returned, Thomas had Mary settled on the porch step, her sobs subsiding into hiccuping breaths. He had already found a clean handkerchief and was dabbing gently at the dirt around the wound. "Hold still now, like a brave little soldier," he encouraged, his voice laced with a playful kindness. Mary, still sniffling, watched him with wide, tear-filled eyes, a flicker of curiosity replacing her distress. Sarah handed him the antiseptic. Thomas poured a small amount onto a fresh corner of the handkerchief. Mary flinched as he carefully cleaned the wound, but Thomas continued to speak to her in soothing tones, distracting her with tales of little woodland creatures and their own scrapes and bruises. He spoke of squirrels falling from trees and bunnies tripping over roots, always ending with how they bravely allowed their mothers to make them feel better. As he meticulously applied the bandage, securing it with gentle precision, Sarah found herself mesmerized. She watched his strong fingers, so capable, so careful, attend to her daughter with a tenderness that stirred something deep within her. It wasn't just the act of bandaging a knee, it was the warmth in his voice, the patient tilt of his head, the way he looked at Mary as if she were the most precious thing in the world. A quiet understanding passed between them when he finished, a silent acknowledgement of the small miracle he had performed. Mary, her tears long forgotten, was now listening intently to Thomas describe the imaginary journey of her whittled boat down a make-believe river. Her scraped knee, now a neat white patch, seemed a trivial thing. Sarah felt a peculiar warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the persistent coldness that had settled there since John's passing. It wasn't the searing heat of a new emotion, but a gentle, steady glow, like embers banked for the night. She saw not just a carpenter, but a man of profound kindness, a quiet strength that offered comfort without demanding anything in return. Her grief, usually a heavy shroud, felt a fraction lighter. Perhaps, she thought, watching Thomas draw a smile from her daughter with a silly face, perhaps healing wasn't always a grand, sweeping gesture. Sometimes it was a gentle touch, a kind word, a scraped knee mended with care. And in that moment, for the first time in a long while, Sarah felt a fragile, unexpected sense of gratitude bloom in her heart. A lighter heart. The air, a familiar blend of fresh-cut pine and damp earth, had become a subtle solace in Sarah's days, weaving itself into the comforting sense of baking bread and simmering stew. For weeks, her world had been a muted watercolor, colors leached, sounds muffled by a thick blanket of grief. Now, however, the sharp edges of sorrow had begun to soften, the oppressive weight in her chest feeling a fraction lighter, like a stone smoothed by a tireless current. She found herself, almost unconsciously, humming a forgotten tune as she kneaded dough, a melody unheard since before the accident. The children, too, seemed to bask in a renewed vibrancy. John had erected a crude but enthusiastic fort in the yard, while Mary, her scraped knee a fading memory, chased butterflies with a joyful abandon Sarah hadn't witnessed in months. One afternoon, as Thomas meticulously restored the porch swing, his hammer a rhythmic counterpoint to the chirping crickets, Sarah sat shelling peas on the step. He was explaining the mechanics of a mortise and tenon joint to John, his voice low and patient, his hands demonstrating with a piece of scrap wood. John, usually a whirlwind of fidgets, was transfixed, his small face scrunched in concentration. A soft chuckle escaped Sarah. Thomas paused, glancing up, a gentle inquiry in his eyes. A flush crept up Sarah's neck. She hadn't realized she was even smiling until that moment. "He's utterly fascinated," she offered, gesturing vaguely at John, who was now attempting to mimic Thomas's precise movements with a stick. Thomas returned her smile, a slow, warm curve that reached his eyes, crinkling them at the corners. "He's a quick study," he said, his gaze lingering on her for a beat longer than necessary. The smile stayed on Sarah's face even after he turned back to his work, a genuine, unbidden curve that felt both alien and wonderful. This lightness was a strange sensation. It wasn't that her love for Michael had diminished, or that the ache of his absence had vanished entirely. Rather, a persistent fog had begun to dissipate, allowing slivers of sunlight to pierce through. Later, while hanging laundry, Sarah found herself humming again. Thomas was on the barn roof, patching a particularly stubborn section of shingles. The sun caught the copper gleam in his hair as he bent to his task. He looked strong, capable, his movements efficient and practiced. A gust of wind billowed a sheet like a sail, briefly obscuring him. When it dropped, he was still there, steady and dependable. A wave of warmth spread through Sarah's chest, surprising her with its intensity. It wasn't merely gratitude for his work, though that was immense. It was something deeper, something she hadn't dared to name, a quiet blossoming of feeling that felt both unsettling and profoundly comforting. Her heart, once a heavy stone, now felt lighter. It beat a little faster, a little stronger, in time with the gentle thud of Thomas's hammer. She thought of the genuine concern in his eyes after Mary's fall, his patience with John, his quiet strength, the way he always seemed to anticipate a need without being asked. These were not the actions of a stranger, but of someone who cared, someone who was slowly, inadvertently, becoming woven into the fabric of their lives. An unexpected thought bloomed. Is this what healing feels like? It wasn't a linear path, she realized. Grief wasn't something that simply disappeared. It transformed, softened, made space for new emotions, new connections. And in that space, a fragile, hopeful seed had begun to take root. She was smiling more, laughing more, and often, without even realizing it until it happened, it was because Thomas was near. The realization was both exhilarating and terrifying. Her heart, after a year cloistered in sorrow, was daring to feel again. And that, she knew, was a monumental shift. Whispers and watchful eyes. The familiar scent of beeswax polish clung to Sarah's hands as she buffed the antique pie safe in her kitchen. Outside, Thomas's hammer provided a steady, comforting counterpoint to the chirping crickets that now populated the twilight air. A low, tuneless melody escaped her lips, a habit recently rediscovered, a small but significant indicator of a deeper shift within. A lightness, long absent, was tentatively unfurling. Later that evening, as Thomas gathered his tools, Sarah lingered at the screen door. "The porch swing feels sturdier than it ever did," she offered, a blush warming her cheeks. Thomas turned, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "It'll withstand many more sunsets, Sarah." Their gazes met, a silent understanding passing between them before he offered a soft, "Good night," and vanished into the fading light. Sarah closed the door, a comforting warmth spreading through her chest. She remained oblivious to the pair of eyes that had witnessed their brief exchange from the lane, or the quick, almost imperceptible nod shared by two women walking home from a quilting bee. The next afternoon, the whispers began. At the general store, while Sarah selected calico for new curtains, fragments of conversation drifted to her. Always at Sarah's place. The children seemed to adore him. The hushed words, like the rustle of dry leaves, carried in the quiet space. Sarah's grip tightened on the fabric. Feigning intense interest in a spool of thread, she kept her back to them, the heat in her face undeniable. It felt like a subtle pressure, a collective breath held just for her. In the days that followed, the scrutiny became more pervasive. On her walks to the market, women's heads would pivot, their conversations abruptly ceasing only to resume with renewed urgency once she passed. Children, usually boisterous, fell silent, their eyes tracking her. Sarah, who had always found solace in Harmony Creek's predictable rhythms, now felt a prickle of disquiet. Each glance, each loaded pause, served as a gentle reminder of the unwritten codes governing their community. One crisp autumn morning, Bishop Stoltz stood on the meeting house porch, hands clasped behind his back. The air was still, carrying the distant ring of Thomas's hammer from Sarah's property. The bishop had observed Thomas's arrival, a quiet man with capable hands. He had noted Thomas's gentle patience with Sarah's children, and he had watched Sarah herself, her posture slowly regaining its uprightness, the lines of sorrow around her eyes softening, replaced by a subtle radiance. He saw Thomas, wiping sweat from his brow, accept a glass of water from Sarah. Their hands brushed, a fleeting, almost imperceptible contact, but the bishop's gaze was sharp, missing nothing. He registered the slight smile that played on Sarah's lips, the way her eyes held Thomas's a moment longer than strictly necessary. His expression remained unreadable, a tapestry of contemplation woven across his weathered face. He understood the delicate balance of grief and renewal, tradition and the human heart. He knew the murmur circulating through the community as surely as he knew the changing seasons. The bishop simply watched, absorbing the quiet unfolding, his thoughts carefully guarded. Sarah felt the weight of those unseen eyes, a phantom touch on her back. She'd always respected Bishop Stoltz, his wisdom a bedrock of their community. Now, however, a flicker of apprehension sparked within her. Was his gaze one of approval, or something else entirely? A knot tightened in her stomach. The warmth Thomas brought into her life was a fragile, budding thing, and she feared Harmony Creek's watchful eyes, even those of its respected leader, might yet threaten its bloom. She longed for the uncomplicated solace Thomas offered, but the world outside her quiet home was beginning to stir, its whispers growing louder. Farewell and lingering feelings. The last nail found its home in the newly repaired shingle on the meeting house roof, a soft thud echoing in the afternoon quiet. Thomas surveyed his work, a sense of quiet satisfaction settling over him. Harmony Creek's bones were mended, stronger now than before the storm. The sun, a warm benediction, gilded the freshly planed wood of the community shed and glinted off the new panes in the schoolhouse windows. His work here was done. He found Mary first, sitting on the porch swing, carefully examining a scraped knee. Her usual boisterous energy was momentarily subdued, a pout on her face. Thomas knelt, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he inspected the crimson mark. "Looks like a warrior's badge," he murmured, producing a small, smooth river stone from his pocket. "For brave girls." Mary's eyes, still bright with unshed tears, lit up. She took the stone, turning it over in her small palm, her injury momentarily forgotten. Daniel, usually glued to his sister's side, was nowhere to be seen, likely off exploring the creek with his whittled boat. Sarah emerged from the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. Her smile faltered slightly as her gaze met Thomas's. He straightened, the unspoken truth of his imminent departure hanging heavy in the air between them. "The last of it," he said, gesturing vaguely towards the meeting house. "Everything's solid." Mary, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, scrambled off the swing and wrapped her arms around Thomas's leg. "Don't go, Thomas." Her voice was a muffled plea against his denim-clad knee. He stroked her hair, a familiar tenderness in the gesture that made Sarah's heart ache. Daniel, drawn by his sister's distress, appeared from around the corner of the house, his eyes wide as he took in the scene. He clutched his small wooden boat, its sails made from a scrap of cloth like a shield. "It's time, little ones," Thomas said, his voice soft but firm. He knelt again, pulling both children into a gentle hug. Mary clung to him, burying her face in his shoulder. Daniel, though less demonstrative, pressed himself close, his small hand gripping Thomas's shirt. The silence that followed was thick with unspoken goodbyes. When he finally stood, the children slowly releasing him, his gaze found Sarah's. The air crackled between them, a current of understanding passing without words. Her heart throbbed, a frantic bird against her ribs. She saw the lingering warmth in his eyes, the reluctant sadness that mirrored her own. The quiet moments they'd shared, the easy laughter, the unspoken comfort, it all coalesced into a profound realization. She was falling for him, deeply and irrevocably. "Sarah," he began, his voice a low rumble. He hesitated, glancing towards the children, then back at her. I'll miss this place." His eyes held hers, a silent question, a shared regret. She swallowed, her throat tight. "We'll miss you, Thomas." Her voice was barely a whisper, imbued with a weight of feeling that went far beyond mere politeness. The unspoken, "I'll miss you," hung in the space between them, a fragile, unspoken promise. He reached out, his calloused thumb brushing lightly against her cheek, a fleeting, tender touch that sent a shiver through her. It was a gesture of farewell, a silent acknowledgement of the connection that had bloomed between them, a connection that now felt impossibly fragile under the watchful, unseen eyes of Harmony Creek. He turned then, a final, lingering look over his shoulder as he walked towards his truck, leaving behind not just mended buildings, but also a profound ache in Sarah's heart, and a lingering hope she hadn't known she possessed. The children stood on the porch, two small figures, watching until the distant rumble of his engine faded into the quiet hum of the countryside. The choice ahead. The last trace of Thomas's truck was a settling cloud of dust over Harmony Creek, a sudden hush that mirrored the quiet in Sarah's soul. She stood on the porch, a ghost of fresh-cut wood scenting the air, a lingering echo of his presence. Mary and Daniel had finally surrendered to sleep, their faces streaked with dried tears, but Sarah found no such solace. The ache in her chest wasn't the familiar, dull throb of grief for her late husband, a sorrow she had long since integrated into her life. This was a new, sharper pang, a desperate yearning she had only just now dared to acknowledge. As the afternoon sun dipped, stretching long shadows across the fields, Sarah moved through her home. Each mended hinge, every rehung frame, whispered Thomas's name, his meticulous touch, his unspoken strength. He hadn't just repaired the physical structure, he had painstakingly mended something within her, too. He'd drawn laughter from her children, offered a listening ear to her unvoiced burdens, and in doing so, had subtly dismantled the formidable wall around her heart. She sank onto the kitchen's sturdy wooden bench, the one Thomas had reinforced, and the enormity of her feelings cascaded over her. It transcended mere gratitude. It was an undeniable, terrifying love. A love for an Englishman. The realization struck her with the force of a sudden downpour, leaving her utterly exposed. To truly embrace this love meant uprooting herself from Harmony Creek, abandoning the entirety of her known world, everything that defined her. The very notion sent a shiver through her. Daniel appeared in the doorway, his eyes still a little puffy. "Mama," he whispered, "will Thomas come back?" Sarah's breath hitched. How could she untangle the complexities of her world for her son? How could she tell him that Thomas, with his gentle smiles and strong hands, hailed from a different existence, a world separated by more than just miles? She knelt, drawing Daniel into her embrace, inhaling the comforting scent of his hair. "I don't know, my sweet one," she murmured, the words catching in her throat. "I truly don't know." Later, as the evening crickets began their rhythmic chorus, Sarah sat by the window, watching the stars bloom in the twilight sky. Her gaze drifted from the familiar silhouettes of the barn and the fields to the distant, unseen world beyond Harmony Creek's borders. The life she had always known was woven into the very warp and weft of this place. The predictable rhythm of the seasons, the shared meals, the comforting certainty of faith and community. It was a life built on simple truths, on unwavering commitment. But Thomas represented a different truth, a different commitment entirely. He embodied the possibility of a joy she hadn't thought herself worthy of, a future that stretched far beyond the confines of her current existence. To choose him would mean exchanging her plain dress for vibrant hues, her German dialect for English, her quiet obedience for a world of choices and freedoms she could barely conceive. It would mean turning her back on her kin, her friends, on the very identity she had carried since birth. The gravity of the decision pressed down on her, a physical ache in her chest. Could she bear to relinquish the familiar comfort of her community? Could she truly sever ties with the life she had pledged to God and her family? Or could she bear to live without the warmth Thomas had ignited within her, a warmth that had finally melted the ice around her heart? The two paths diverged sharply, each beckoning with a distinct promise, each demanding an unimaginable sacrifice. The choice ahead was not merely about love. It was about who Sarah truly was and who she was brave enough to become. Seeking counsel. The buggy ride to Bishop Stoltz's farm felt longer than usual, each turn of the wheels grinding against Sarah's apprehension. The spring air, typically a source of comfort, offered no solace today, its gentle breeze only stirring the unease within her. She clutched the reins, her knuckles white, her gaze fixed on the familiar path that now seemed fraught with an unknown peril. This was a journey she had made countless times for counsel on crops, community disputes, or spiritual guidance. Never before had her heart felt so heavy, so irrevocably split. Bishop Stoltz was in his workshop, the scent of fresh-cut wood mingling with the faint aroma of pipe tobacco. He looked up as she entered, his spectacles perched on the bridge of his nose, his expression calm as ever. "Sarah, a good day to you. Come in, sit." He gestured to a worn wooden chair across from his workbench. He didn't ask why she was there, his silent invitation a testament to his understanding of human nature and the unspoken burdens people carried. Sarah sat, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze flickering around the room, avoiding his steady eyes. "Bishop," she began, her voice a reedy whisper, I have come seeking counsel." He nodded, setting aside a half-finished birdhouse. "Speak freely, child. Your heart troubles you." The directness of his perception both eased and heightened her anxiety. She took a deep breath, the words catching in her throat like burrs. "It is about Thomas, the carpenter." A flicker, perhaps of recognition, perhaps of something else entirely, crossed his face, but his expression remained largely unreadable. "A good man, from what I have observed. He has done fine work on your home, and on others." "He has," Sarah agreed, her voice gaining a little strength. "He has done more than mend the roof and walls, Bishop. He has mended something in me, in my children." The confession tumbled out, hesitant at first, then with a rush of unburdened feeling. "Since Jacob passed, there has been a hollow, a coldness. I thought it was just grief, something I would carry always. But Thomas, he brought warmth back, laughter to the children, and to me." She paused, searching his face for judgment, but found only quiet attentiveness. "Bishop, I have feelings for him, feelings I never thought I would have again, feelings that scare me. He is English, and I love him." The last word hung in the air, raw and vulnerable, a declaration to herself as much as to him. Bishop Stoltz leaned back in his chair, his gaze drifting to the window, where a robin fluttered past. "Love is a powerful force, Sarah. It can bring joy, and it can bring challenge. You have honored Jacob's memory, and your mourning has been true. No one can fault you for the path your heart has taken." He turned back to her, his eyes kind. "But you understand the implications." Sarah nodded, her throat tight. "The community, my life here, what it means to choose someone from outside." The unspoken word, Englishman, hung heavy between them. Our community is built on foundations of faith and shared life, the bishop said slowly, his voice gentle but firm. These are not easily set aside. To leave would be to leave much of what defines you, what has always guided you. He paused, allowing his words to sink in. And yet, God grants us free will. He desires our happiness, Sarah, within the bounds of his word. It is a choice, one you must make with prayer and conviction. He stood, walking to a shelf filled with theological texts. I cannot tell you what to do, Sarah. My role is to offer guidance, to remind you of our faith, our traditions. But the path ahead, the steps you take, those are yours alone to choose. Your heart is an honest one, and you have sought guidance from the Lord through me. Now you must seek it directly, within yourself. He handed her a small, worn hymnal. Take this. Read Psalm 23. Find comfort and clarity. His eyes held a depth of understanding that transcended mere words. Whatever path you choose, Sarah, know that you are loved by your community and by God. And whatever decision you make, it must be one you can live with, in peace, before Him. Sarah clutched the hymnal, its familiar cover a small anchor in the storm of her emotions. The bishop hadn't condemned her, hadn't forbidden her. He had simply laid out the truth, a truth she already knew, but hearing it from him gave it a different weight. The choice was hers, terrifying in its freedom, profound in its implications. A new path. The scent of damp earth and distant wood smoke clung to Sarah as she walked away from Bishop Stoltz's home. The cool breeze, once a comfort, now felt like a physical representation of the chasm that had opened before her. He had not forbidden her feelings, nor had he offered an easy absolution. Instead, he had laid bare the cost, the unvarnished truth of a path chosen outside the established fences. And as she walked, each step firmer than the last, a quiet certainty solidified within her. The gnawing ache in her chest, a constant companion since David's death, had lessened in Thomas's presence. Her children's laughter, once a faint echo in the hollow rooms of their home, now rang clear and true. This was not a betrayal of David, she realized, but a blossoming of life he would have wanted for them all. She found Thomas in the barn, the rhythmic rasp of sandpaper against wood filling the air. He was hunched over a new gatepost, his brow furrowed in concentration, sawdust clinging to the dark curls at his temples. The sight of him, so utterly absorbed in his craft, sent a warm current through her. He looked up as she entered. His blue eyes, usually quick to smile, now held a question. The dust motes danced in the shafts of sunlight piercing the barn's gaps, illuminating the quiet tension between them. "Thomas," she began, her voice a little steadier than she expected. He straightened, wiping his hands on his denim apron, his gaze never leaving hers. I've spoken with the bishop." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a flicker of apprehension crossing his face. He waited, his silence a patient invitation for her to continue. "He spoke of choices," she said, stepping closer, the scent of fresh-cut wood and his subtle cologne enveloping her. "Of what it means to step outside what is known." She paused, gathering her courage, her eyes searching his for understanding. "And I have chosen." A breath hitched in her throat, a fragile hope blossoming in the space between them. I want a future with you, Thomas, for myself and for the children, whatever that future may be." The words, once so terrifying, now felt like a release, a dam breaking. A slow smile spread across Thomas's face, transforming his features. The worry etched there moments before melted away, replaced by an incandescent joy that mirrored her own. He took a hesitant step towards her, then another, until he stood directly before her, his hands gently cupping her face. His calloused thumbs traced the line of her jaw, a touch that spoke volumes. "Sarah," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "Are you certain? Do you understand what this what this means? His eyes, brimming with a mixture of disbelief and profound tenderness, searched hers for any trace of doubt. She nodded, her own eyes welling up. "I understand," she whispered. "It means leaving much behind, but it also means choosing life, choosing joy, and choosing you." A single tear escaped her eye, but it was not a tear of sorrow. It was a tear of liberation, of hope. Thomas leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a feather-light touch, a silent promise. It was not a kiss of passion, but one of profound affirmation, a gentle sealing of a new covenant. "Then we will build it, Sarah," he murmured against her lips, his voice thick with emotion. "A new life. Together. Brick by brick, beam by beam, just like we've fixed this old house. Whatever comes, we'll face it as a family." He pulled her into a warm embrace, holding her close, and Sarah felt a lightness she hadn't experienced in years. The quiet hum of the barn, the scent of wood, and the comfort of Thomas's arms felt like the most solid foundation she had ever known. A new path stretched before them, uncertain and challenging, but for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt ready to walk it. She was no longer just a widow in mourning. She was a woman embracing a new dawn. Beyond Harmony Creek. The wind, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant bleating of sheep, stirred the hem of Sarah's dress as she stood at the edge of Harmony Creek. Beside her, Daniel and Mary, both still faced from their earlier tears, clung to her hands, their small bodies radiating a mixture of apprehension and a child's simple trust. The familiar silhouette of their home, now just a dark outline against the fading twilight, seemed to recede with each passing moment, becoming a memory even as they watched. There were no spoken goodbyes, no grand pronouncements, only the quiet shift of gravel beneath their worn shoes, a silent acknowledgement of the path they were leaving behind. Sarah closed her eyes for a fleeting second, picturing David's smile, his strong hands, the life they had built. A pang of grief, familiar yet less sharp, pierced her. She opened her eyes, finding comfort in the small, warm hands in hers. This wasn't an abandonment, she realized, but a courageous step forward. Then, a flicker of light in the distance, a lantern, held aloft, growing steadily brighter. Thomas. Her heart gave a joyful lurch, a feeling so potent it almost brought tears to her eyes. He was there, waiting, a beacon in the twilight. "There he is," she whispered, her voice a little shaky, but full of an undeniable hope. Daniel, whose initial tears had been for Thomas's supposed departure, stirred, a small, sleepy smile touching his lips. Mary, too, seemed to sense the shift in the air, her grip loosening as she turned her face towards the approaching light. They walked then, not a flight, but a measured, deliberate journey. With each step, the air seemed to lighten, the weight of their past slowly shedding. Thomas met them halfway, his face illuminated by the soft glow of the lantern, a smile that reached his eyes. He didn't speak, merely extended a hand to Sarah, a silent promise in the gesture. She took it, feeling the warmth of his skin, the comforting strength of his presence. He then scooped up Daniel, who, despite his earlier sorrow, now nestled contentedly against Thomas's shoulder, a soft sigh escaping him. Mary, always a step behind but never far, reached for Thomas's free hand, her small fingers wrapping around his. The journey beyond Harmony Creek unfolded in a series of vignettes, each one a brushstroke on the canvas of their new life. There was the small, sturdy cottage Thomas had painstakingly prepared, its windows casting a welcoming glow into the twilight. Inside, the scent of wood smoke and dried herbs filled the air, a stark contrast to the quiet austerity of their former home. Sarah found a joy she hadn't known existed, watching Thomas patiently teach Daniel how to carve a small wooden bird, his large hands surprisingly gentle. She smiled as Mary, her face smeared with flour, helped Thomas bake a simple bread, their laughter echoing through the cozy rooms. The days stretched into weeks, then months, each one weaving a stronger fabric of their shared existence. Sarah discovered a new rhythm to her life, a freedom in the choices she now made. She learned to cook meals with spices she'd never encountered, to mend clothes with new stitches, to plant a small garden with plants unfamiliar to her touch. Thomas's presence was a constant, steadying force, his quiet strength a balm to her once wounded heart. He never rushed her, never pressured her, simply offered his unwavering love and support. The children thrived in this new environment. Daniel, once so reserved, blossomed into a curious, adventurous boy, his questions ceaseless, his energy boundless. Mary, who had clung to Sarah in the aftermath of her father's death, now explored with a quiet confidence, her artistic inclination finding an outlet in the wildflowers she collected and the intricate patterns she drew in the dirt. Their laughter, once a rare sound, now filled the cottage, a symphony of joy that resonated deep within Sarah's soul. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery hues, Sarah sat on the small porch swing, Daniel and Mary asleep inside. Thomas joined her, his arm naturally finding its way around her shoulders. "Are you happy, Sarah?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. She leaned into him, the familiar comfort of his embrace a testament to how far they had come. "More than I ever thought possible," she confessed, a tear tracing a path down her cheek, not of sorrow, but of profound gratitude. "Thank you, Thomas, for everything." He kissed the top of her head, a silent acknowledgement of the journey they had shared, the challenges they had faced, and the beautiful, unexpected life they were building, brick by loving brick, beyond the familiar banks of Harmony Creek. It was a life born of courage, sustained by love, and forever imprinted with the kindness that had healed her heart.